Hello, everyone. This is Masako Ganaha. Today, I have a wonderful guest who is in the United States. Thank you very much, James.
Well, thank you. The honor is mine. I'm happy to hear, people in Japan interested in this information.
So many Japanese people, they only know about the word pandemic treaty. So as we warn to the world, there is so much confusion about what is actually happening at World Health Organization.
I think I can say this pretty clearly. Unless a person, has actually read the document, if anyone has been listening to the media, what somebody said about the document, please realize that it has gone through many revisions, and there are other documents that are being negotiated at the same time, and everyone is getting them all confused. You've probably got inaccurate information, misinformation. And so hopefully we can clarify a lot of that.
So today we are going to talk about basically two documents, so-called pandemic treaty. When we say pandemic treaty, there is a document titled very long words, so I don't even remember, but I like the shortened ones, WHOCA+.
Yes.
And then, yes. Let me finish.
If we partition what we're talking about so that we don't get them all mixed up. So we'll start off talking about what most people call the pandemic treaty, but its official name actually comes from in the WHO Constitution, which is a totally separate document all the way back from 1948. In Article 19, the WHO was given the authority when the nations accepted that constitution to negotiate a convention or an agreement. And so that's where the CA comes from, the WHO CA, Convention Agreement. Now, a convention, while many people refer to it as a treaty, it's very, very different. An example would be the Framework Convention for Climate Change that the United Nations adopted back in 1992. The concept is, with a framework convention, they don't necessarily work out all of the details. They agree to a framework, and then they agree to put other people in charge and set up a system where they'll meet every year or however often they want to meet, and all of the detailed protocols will get worked out later. Well, that is just absolutely dangerous. Agreeing to let someone else make decisions where you no longer have any input, to me, it is absurd. It is not something that should ever be done. They're in a hurry to get an agreement. Well, they can't work out the details, so they agree to put someone else in charge to work out the details later. If this was a business contract and someone said, here, sign this paper and you agree to whatever we decide to do later, and you don't have anything to say about it, that's crazy. But that's what they're trying to do. When people say the word treaty, your mind thinks, well, you put words on paper or, a digital document, and everybody read the words and they agreed to them and they signed it, and you have a document and that's the agreement. Okay. Well, that's not what this is. This is an agreement to let somebody else work out the details, not to mention all the money later. And that's just so dangerous. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. But that's what they're doing or trying to.
I see. So that's the core issue that we have to discuss when we talking about this WHOCA+. So it's just like basically it's like agree to give authority to dictate us. Yeah, that's the framework convention really means. And
so to continue talking about the WHOCA+, and then it goes on for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. here's the interesting part. Back in April, early April, they were having their negotiating meetings. And quite frankly, the nations were arguing amongst themselves. They were not all in agreement. And I think in frustration, the negotiating body, the intergovernmental negotiating body said, okay, by April 22nd of this year, so a number of months ago, all of the nations, whatever text they would like to submit, please submit it by April 22nd. And then by May 22nd, they would make public a compilation text of what all of the nations wanted to, have be part of this WHO framework convention. Well, all of the nations submitted text, but it's been kept secret. We're not allowed to see it. It's called the compilation text. It's a 208-page document. They talk about it. It clearly exists, and the nations know, the delegates know, but we, the people, have not been allowed to see what the nations have submitted. We have no way, we do not know. Now, they talk about it over and over and over again, so I know that the document exists, but they won't let us see it. What they did, originally they did this on May 22nd, but then formally they did it on June the 2nd. From that 208-page document, the bureaucracy or the bureau in the WHO edited down to a 43-page document from the 208-page document, and they call that the bureau's text. And so they keep saying that this is a member nation-led process, meaning the individual delegates from the nations are in charge of, this negotiation. But the WHO bureaucracy edited out what the nations say they wanted, and they have this bureau's text that is, only 43 pages. So many nations are upset that what they presented is not in the document that they're working on. And officially, they have said that they have still not come to an agreement on a first draft. Okay? So the simple fact that there is secrecy, that some of the things that some nations have submitted to be in the draft was edited out, and the process is moving forward, and no one is allowed to see what's going on, and that in and of itself is a problem. So what I'm going to discuss now for the next maybe 5 or 10 minutes is what we have been allowed to see in this edited 43-page bureau's text. Now, what I was talking about earlier, if you get the document, and please do, you can go to my many websites. Hopefully you'll put them in the description to this video and people can see all of this. There's 3 chapters in this 43 pages. And the first chapter is pretty much just propaganda, right? They talk about human rights and equity and, transparency. They talk about transparency, but yet they're keeping all of this secret. Okay, so chapter 1 is, in my view, propaganda. Chapter 3 is where they discuss how they would operate after it's been agreed to, who would be in charge, and how would they run the operation of implementing this agreement. And so chapter 3 is really where people should start, because it talks about how they would set up a conference of the parties, which would include, the member nations who agree to it, but also representatives from the manufacturing companies that make what they call pandemic response products, drugs and jabs and testing and so forth. And so they would have a seat at the table. And in addition, there would be representatives from various United Nations organizations and other foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and so forth and so on, they would all participate in the future in Conference of the Parties meetings to decide on the detailed protocols about how to spend the $30 billion a year that they want to allocate to this. Now, the most concerning part of it is that when they decide on any protocols, those protocols would not come back to Japan or the United States or any other nation for approval by Parliament or Congress or Senate or whatever it may be called in the various nations. Having agreed to the Framework Convention and setting up the Conference of the Parties, they would decide, and that would be that. And so it's very similar to what has happened with the Framework Convention for Climate Change. Decisions are made and the people have no say. And then we find our governments doing things that most people think are crazy because we agreed to let somebody else work out the details. Okay. Now, what's in the body of the agreement that is still being negotiated is not what people think it is. Okay. If you have heard anything about the pandemic treaty, it's probably wrong. Okay. It probably came from other documents that we'll talk about in a little bit. But unless you've heard somebody speaking very specifically about the June 2nd version of the Bureau's text of the WHO CA+, and I know that's a mouthful, what you've heard is probably wrong. Okay? What's in the body of this agreement is primarily setting up a laboratory network so that they could do testing all over the world. And by testing, I mean maybe sticking a swab up your nose to take a sample, or in some other orifice of your body, or if you take a pet to a veterinarian and they swab the pet's nose or stool sample or something like that, or for people who have animals, wherever their bedding is for their animals, or your septic system or sewage system, your waste water treatment facility, or local hospitals, or anywhere on the planet. If they're able to find some genomic sequence from some purported pathogen, they want to have a network to share those pathogens. Now, arguably, that's very dangerous. They want to share potentially, pathogenic, with pathogens with pandemic potential. They want to immediately share, have everyone in the world looking for a problem and then share it and research it so that they could turn it into drugs and jabs and then identify, oh, well, we found something that might cause a problem. It wouldn't require that there had been some illness or death because of it. They just find something in your sewers, or they find something on your farm, or they find something in a hospital near you, and they say, oh, this might be a problem, so everybody needs to get jabbed.
Oh.
And a lot of money can be made doing that. And so what they want to set up, and this is in the the 43-page document, something called a Pathogen Access Benefit Sharing System, PABS. Nations look at pathogens that they find in their nation as a national resource. If they find a pathogen and they share the pathogen, they want benefit for that. Okay, that's not a health-related issue. That's a world trade issue. That's a fair trade issue. And so what is really being negotiated in regards to what is going on now, it's got nothing to do with health. They're looking for things that are deadly. they want to control the money and the intellectual property for things that can harm other people. In my view, this is worldwide, global, open source biological research, bioweapons research. And the last thing in the world that I feel we should be doing is funding something that could lead to biological weapons, rather than negotiating an agreement to facilitate that. They should be negotiating an agreement to stop that completely. Stop digging into Mother Nature, finding things that could be made to be deadly. Basically, my understanding is that the bacteria excretes compounds that protect it from pathogens that would harm the bacteria. And so in protecting itself, if you can help that organism create compounds, then you can use the beneficial compounds. That's valid research in my view. But to be seeking out pathogens with pandemic potential, sharing them everywhere in the world, is the exact opposite of what we should be doing. Okay, so that is what most people, that is in the document that most people refer to as the Pandemic Treaty. It's not really a treaty, it's a framework convention, and it's really an attempt to have nations in the world finance the building out of what I call the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex. They want to build out the biological weapons industry. That's crazy. But, they present it in a way that sounds wonderful. Okay. But the Indonesian health minister, back in November of 2022, he was presenting to, business people in Bali. He referred to yet another document, so I don't want to confuse people. I'm talking about another document now. The United States had worked with the World Bank to set up the Pandemic Fund. We have pledged $1 billion a year into the Pandemic Fund, and they've already been distributing money to build out laboratories to do exactly what I'm talking about. And the Indonesian health minister said to the audience of business leaders, go invest. This is a great business opportunity. They want billions of dollars to go into laboratories and testing equipment and research and all that sort of stuff. This is money laundering and corruption, and they want to create a cabal of people that we don't know who they are, who then create a cartel, because it would have to be WHO certified laboratories. You couldn't have an independent. You're not part of the game. You're not going to get any money. You've got to be part of their network. They'll funnel tens of billions of dollars into finding things that they can make injections to treat, even though, if you just left Mother Nature alone, it really isn't causing anybody any problems. So Meryl Nass recently wrote a very long and in-depth article about how this is likely to make pandemics more common because there's money to be made by finding something that could potentially cause a pandemic. It's insanity.
Oh, I see. So then the core function that they are going to establish for WHOCA Plus is to create a worldwide bio lab pharmaceutical complex industry network. Oh.
And they want manufacturing to be built out in nations who, currently don't necessarily have the manufacturing capacity, right? And so this all started really back in early 2021 with something, and I'm changing gears here a little bit. I'm going to talk about a different document. The research was, early 2021, but I believe it was in May of 2021, Helen Clark, who is a former Prime Minister of New Zealand, presented the independent panel's proposal for the pandemic treaty. And they said very clearly that they wanted a framework convention, and they wanted $31 billion a year to start, what we've been talking about here. And so it started, more than 2 years ago. And what happened, if you think back in time to 2020, everyone was afraid of this new, problem. I'm not even going to talk about what may or may not actually have happened, but people were concerned, and the propaganda was, oh, don't do anything, just wait for the vaccine. And so in early 2020, late 2020, early 2021, everybody in the world, they wanted everyone to be injected. And obviously, the manufacturing capacity could not instantaneously have enough jabs for the entire world. So what happened is, rather than follow the original plan, which was healthcare workers who are exposed to people who might be ill, and elderly people or people who might be vulnerable, they were all across the world supposed to be given the jabs first. Well, that's not how it happened. The United States, the European Union, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand bought up, 10 times what they needed. And so relatively poor nations felt that they were not being treated equitably from a trade perspective. The rich nations were hoarding all of these injections. And the latest statistics now are roughly 75% of people in wealthier nations have been jabbed, but maybe only 25% of people in poor nations have been jabbed. Well, they were unhappy that it was being hoarded because it was looked at as a life-saving product at the time. They believed, oh, this is wonderful, right? And so they called for a special session of the World Health Assembly. They normally only meet once a year, but they met in November, December of 2021. And they said, we need an international agreement, not about health. This is the thing that everybody has to understand. This is not about how you treat a respiratory infection. This is a trade dispute about access to products. Okay, so they said, we need an agreement. And so they created the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body. They've been negotiating and negotiating and negotiating and negotiating. There aren't really any doctors, right? You guys are arguing about, you want more of something that is a worse problem than it was trying to treat. And so in retrospect, the relatively poor nations are quite lucky that the rich nations were greedy. But they cannot get out of their mind the dollar signs floating in front of their eyes as to how much money could be made by tricking even more people into getting an injection for a problem that, the treatment actually makes the problem worse. So the insanity of what's going on here is they're arguing for more poison. They want to profit by setting up the manufacturing and the testing and all of the surveillance. And there's a lot of money to be made if they pull off this agreement. But people are not going to be made healthier. That's not what this is about. This is a trade dispute about intellectual property and pathogen access and benefit sharing, and manufacturing, distribution, logistics, all that sort of stuff. If all of this sounds different than what you might have heard about the quote unquote pandemic treaty, it's because there has been a lot of misinformation. If you actually read the 43-page Bureau's text, you realize that, in my view, it should be negotiated by the World Trade Organization, if at all, this is not anything that anybody wants. It would facilitate gain of function research. It would facilitate the sharing of pathogens with pandemic potential and the benefits that making vaccines, this is all about money. It's not about your health. Okay. And so now I know maybe we only have about 20 minutes or so. So now I'll talk about what is also going on at the same time. And this is how I got involved. I identified, as I mentioned earlier, that the Biden administration had attempted to change an existing agreements. Please do go right ahead.
Yes. Before you go into IHR, I would like to ask you one question. You mentioned in the end about this treaty, supposed to be called trade negotiation. So including myself, I thought I was like understanding better than before, but you now made me even more realize it's not what's being heard, what we have been like informed. So in a sense, people who are making misinformation, doing disinformation campaign are very much succeeding in confusing us, and they are disguising this as like, oh, pandemic treaty. So we have to like this by this treaty, they're going to restrict our freedom. But this itself is a misinformation.
Yes.
I see.
Now, what this agreement, and again, it's not a treaty, it's a framework convention, it would not inherently give power to the WHO. It would give authority to a totally new bureaucracy called the Conference of the Parties. We talked about that. It's in Chapter 3. So it would set up this independent group that would make decisions. They would meet at least on a yearly basis. They could meet as often as they wanted. They could make specific protocols that they would agree to, and we would have nothing to say about it. Okay, so it's a loss of control, a loss of sovereignty, in the sense that it's not the Director General of the WHO, Tedros. It would set up a new committee within the WHO. It would name the Conference of the Parties, who would be the delegates from the nations, the manufacturers, and all of the foundations in the UN. The problem is we have no idea who these people would be. We would not select them. We would not vote for them. They would not be accountable to us. We wouldn't even know what they were doing. And so to agree to this is to hand over control, not of your health care. Okay? It would hand over control over billions of dollars to build up an industry, and the product of that industry would be fear and injections that would harm you, while they're telling you that the injections are going to protect you. Now, that's not saying that you have to have them, but the power behind that would be so pervasive, and the propaganda is so, expertly done, that 75% of people in developed nations believed that the first time. So they want to do it more. And so where that really becomes a problem is in the international health regulations.